This is Gen X Movie Month, the series where I revisit a month of movies from my latchkey kid childhood, including how these films are viewed by modern audiences. In this episode, I'm going to take a look at July of 1977, where according to Box Office Mojo, the top movies that month were Star Wars and The Spy Who Loved Me. As I pointed out in the December of 1979 episode featuring Star Trek the Motion Picture, link in the description below, data from that far back isn't super reliable, hence only 2 movies on the list. You may be thinking, hey Pete, Star Wars came out in May of 77, so why is this episode about July? Movie distribution worked very differently back then, and as a first grader I lived in the very isolated Imperial Valley of southeastern California, so it didn't get to us until then. Seeing Star Wars for the first time, and doing so at a drive-in, was the definitive moment of my childhood. And there have been so many pieces of media about Star Wars over the years, it's difficult to find an original angle on the subject. So, I decided to make this episode about how it affected 4 generations of my family. Rather than hear a lot of commentary from me, in this episode, you'll hear interviews from the people closest to me. Starting with my childhood best friend, who will describe the drive-in movie experience that younger generations miss out on today. We didn't meet until a few years after Star Wars came out, but going to a drive-in was a pretty regular sleepover thing we'd do together. Then I've got an interview with my baby boomer parents, who are in their late 70s now, but have pretty vivid memories of taking me to see Star Wars for the first time at a drive-in. My wife and I waited to become parents for 8 years after we got married, but I have a millennial nephew who I showered with a big box of Star Wars stuff when he was about 6, and he's been hooked ever since. To round out 4 generations of Star Wars stories, there's the Gen Z person I raised, and how my Star Wars obsession influenced their childhood. Really quickly though, not everybody likes Roger Moore's portrayal of James Bond, and I get why. His version is a lot campier than anybody else who played the role, often giving a wink and a smile at the audience, knowing how over the top the plots and the gadgets of those movies are. I like his version just fine, and The Spy Who Loved Me is a good use of 2 hours. I saw Star Wars at the Valley View Drive-In in Brawley, California in July of 1977. Link in the description below to this page on that theater over at Cinema Treasures. Later, I would pretty regularly go to the Mission Tiki Drive-In in Montclair, California from 1979 to 1984 with my childhood best friend's family in an experience you just can't get today. We're in our early 50s now, but he and I talk a couple of times a year still. Here's a conversation we had about what it was like to go on those drive-in movie trips. So one of the things that we would do pretty regularly when I'd come spend the night at your house was we'd go to that Mission Tiki drive-in in Montclair that just closed in January.
It just closed like a couple of months ago.
One of the last drive-ins standing, right? And so many younger people than us didn't have that experience.
Yeah.
But I remember it was pretty regular that your parents used to take advantage of that camper, right?
Yes, we did.
Remember that? Can you describe that?
Yeah. So we had that was my first car. Was that truck? Was a 1970s Chevy, 3/4 ton truck. Before extra cabs.
Right.
And we had the full. It's a real truck, so it has the 8-foot bed. And my dad had taken the tailgate off, moved the bumper out 2 feet, put a wood plank in there, and we had this really nice camper. The bathroom was only a porta potty and a sink. But if you remember right, I would call my parents' bed above the cab.
Yeah.
Was huge.
It was very big.
You could lay people from front to back and get like 6 kids in there, no problem.
And it had a window, right? It had a window.
Right, had that window right in the front,
out.
so you could watch it. And that's still back in the day when they had to put the boxes, in the window,
metal box. Yeah.
To get the audio. But so we would go and lay up there and watch the movie.
I remember a couple of times your mom said like the rule was we could watch the first movie, but then she'd take away the speaker. But that didn't keep us from going to sleep. Like that didn't, right? we would watch all kinds of things we probably weren't supposed to be watching across all screens when we were supposed to be sleeping just without sound.
Right. So like Ghostbusters ended, but yet Temple of Doom was on screen number 2 during the minecart scene.
Yeah.
Or something like that, right?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it didn't work out real well. but I mean, for them.
Well, not in terms of enforcing sleep habits, but it worked out
Yes.
great for us.
Yes, it did.
Back to July of 77 and the Valley View drive-in. Here's a conversation with my parents about that night. And keep in mind, when you're 78 years old like my dad is, you can cough whenever you want. So Star Wars came out in May, but it really didn't come to us in the Imperial Valley till it was more like July, I want to say.
Yeah.
So what do you remember about that drive-in, and what do you remember about how excited I was to go see it?
Well, I do remember that a lot of people were still going to drive-ins then. And so you had to get in line.
To even get into the drive-in, right?
Yes, and there was a chance that if you were at the back of the line, there wouldn't be a good place for you to park your car.
Right.
We were in line very early, and we got the best parking place because I think we were the second or third car in.
Well, we didn't have a lot else to do
No.
because we didn't have a lot of money back then.
True.
Well,
So a drive-in was a big thing.
going to the drive-in was expensive, and we would bring our own treats because we couldn't afford to go to the snacks shack. So
Now, that was not all we brought when we went and saw Star Wars, right? So I brought some special items with me in the back seat of that 1976 sky blue Granada that we had at the time.
yes, you were going to be a rebel,
Yes.
and you had to be prepared in case the bad guys came in and tried to get you.
Well, you never know, Mom. I mean, they could pop through the screen. They could choose Brawley, California.
They could
come through the screen and attack.
Yes.
They were like, you know
First
what?
place I'd go is Brawley if I was an alien.
I know, right? And like, you better get after that kid in the back seat of the 76 Granada.
Right.
So this was even old enough that it was mono speaker, right? It was one of those like big metal things that you had to hang on the
there was
inside.
a pole, and you put it in the window.
And it
and
always
then you
looked like it was
cranked
going to
it up.
break the window, right? But it kind of never did.
If you just hung it from the glass, there was a chance you were not going to go back with all the glass.
Right.
So we had to, in the desert, have the windows up.
After dark, it was probably only like 95 degrees though, right? So
Right,
Yeah, it was cool.
right. But remember, we brought a cooler full of stuff.
so I had a phaser,
Yes,
and then there was another like laser gun from the Space 1999 line that I had as well.
yes.
And I probably had one in each hand, if I remember correctly. Now, how would you describe my reaction to this movie upon seeing it for the first time?
So you're watching it and you're seeing the letters go up and away with the little dots all the way around it, trying to look like spacey. And you're in the back seat and you've got a hand on each of the backs of our seats and you're jumping up and down, yelling "Bad-O." And we're looking at each other thinking, wasn't it good we didn't go to an indoor?
So I'm jumping up and down in the back seat, yelling "Nito Bado" to anything that I see.
Yes. And then when the lightsabers came out for various battles, you were trying to replicate them in the back seat.
Right.
And that's when your dad and I had to scrunch down because we did not want to lose our heads.
Right.
It was just like total joy. You had the best time.
Oh,
you
did,
just talked and talked and
It was
talked
so much fun
about
to see
that.
you. You just enjoyed yourself so much.
It was just seeing how much joy you got out of it. And that jumping up and down, we decided that we weren't going to stop you. If you wanted to jump up and down in the back seat and yell, we had the windows
Go
closed.
ahead and have fun.
The windows were closed. You weren't bothering anybody else, but you had a wonderful time.
Well, and that's what, in hindsight, that's what was so unique about it, was if we had seen it in a walk-in theater, I would have had to behave myself in a very different way.
Right.
And because we didn't, because we were a little bit muffled because we were in the car, you let me just basically go berserk, and it
Yeah.
made it a much richer experience for me.
Well, good.
Yes.
We're glad we did.
As evidenced by these pictures of my childhood bedroom, this was a big deal for me, and I would spend the next 47 years and counting being obsessed with Star Wars. On the left is my school picture from the next September, and you can just barely see the top of the iron-on seen in full on the right that I got from a vintage online store, link in the description. Yes, Vader is misspelled because that's the kind of quality merch we had in the 70s. But that's not all. I was so into Star Wars that I asked Santa Claus that year for a, quote, Jedi Knight uniform, without really knowing what that was. I mean, Obi-Wan wore robes that we now know to be the standard look for a Jedi, but back then we thought it was just exclusive to him. Basically, I asked for an impossible gift, and my mom delivered in a very big way. So the two Star Wars related memorable things from my childhood were seeing the film itself the first time. And then, like, everybody has a favorite Christmas gift of all time. And the amount of effort that you put into my Christmas gift that year was Star Wars related. So, Mom, what do you remember about that? And I think you still physically have it, right?
I do. It's in when you want it, you can have it back. It's in the garage, all folded and neat and nice. I made you a Jedi Knight's uniform because that's what you asked Santa Claus for. I think you were testing Santa Claus, but you really wanted a Jedi Knight uniform.
Right.
So all we saw was a guy in a little white karate uniform. So I found a pattern that looked like a jumpsuit that pilots would wear.
Right.
And so I put all the extra pockets and epaulets and all this other stuff on it. And Sandy and I went down to the Army Navy surplus store, and we found a barrel full of patches that go on uniforms. And we sorted them by anything that didn't say like the 5th Brigade or something like that.
So things that
anything
didn't have words on it.
Right. That could be mistaken for a Star Wars kind of thing. We found a belt for you, and we found a belt buckle that had 2 crossed. Actually, they were cannons.
Yeah, but you told me they were lightsabers, and I believe
they were lightsabers at our house.
As I got into my late 20s, and without a kid of my own to initiate into the fandom yet, I found a willing participant in one of my nephews, who I got into Star Wars despite us not living near each other. When he was 5 or 6, I sent him my copy of the Faces VHS set that I didn't need anymore because I had just purchased the widescreen set on VHS. I threw in a bunch of action figures from my way too big collection at the time. An adult now, here's his recollection of that experience.
I remember getting this box in the mail that was probably bigger than I was, and just opening it, and it's like, it took me an hour to get everything. It was like, but wait, there's more. And there just was more action figures and more action figures in the VHS set. And I am a like prime example of I was pretty much like the perfect VHS age, because like 97, 98, 23, 99 was like prime Disney VHS masterpiece collections.
Sure.
We had every single one. Man, I could tell you what it smells like, a VHS. The
plastic, right? Those big plastic cases. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, it takes me back. That's probably my number one nostalgia thing of my childhood.
So for you, that's how you saw like all the Disney Renaissance films then?
Yes. So I had all the Disney Renaissance, all the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age. I think canonically every single Disney Animation Studios film except for Saludos Amigos.
Enough. So you get to the VHSs, and by this point you're a pro with the Renaissance films and so forth. But this is very different, right? Was this maybe even the first PG movie you saw?
It was definitely the first, let's call it the first like non-90s family-oriented movie.
Sure.
Or You know what I mean? Probably my first non-Disney live action film.
Now, you admitted to me today that earlier you thought the beginning was boring. It admittedly, by modern standards, it starts slow.
I can remember having the big box in the living room with all the action figures and A New Hope on the TV. And I'm like, I'm playing with the action figures, and all I can think is they've been in the sand for 20 hours now. It's like boring. Why are they still in the sand?
Right.
That was my first thought of A New Hope years and years ago.
But then they pull into Mos Eisley, right? And things pick up.
Right, right. And then pretty much from the time we get on the Millennium Falcon, then it's good from a 5-year-old's perspective.
So other than the beginning that you found boring, what was your impression of the rest of it? First viewing, what playing with action figures?
First impression was just Chewie and Han as a child. You know, them on the Millennium Falcon, they're cool. You know, Han saves the day at the end, comes back. The first movie was all them. That's what I went for.
Han saves the day. That's an interesting perspective.
After he walks away, comes back, saves the day, and he says like "wahoo" or something. I've tried to imitate that my whole life, and I can't quite get it.
That's how I got my nephew into lifelong Star Wars fandom, even though his attachment to Han and Chewie is very different than mine is to Luke. But what if you were raised by me around this Star Wars obsession since birth? As I've mentioned on other videos, my kid is currently a college junior and in a BFA acting program, but also writes both plays and screenplays as well. What comes out in this final interview is not only an attachment to Leia, but to Carrie Fisher as well. There's, at least within the family, there's a famous picture of you holding an action figure Rune Heiko mint on card from my episode 1 collection that I had at the time of your birth. So presumably you don't ever remember not knowing that Star Wars was a thing.
I don't necessarily remember you saying to me like you'll watch it when you're older, but I remember a time before I had seen Star Wars, but that I at least knew it existed, and I knew that it was a thing you loved, so I kind of automatically thought it was cool. And then a time after I had seen Star Wars and we were in agreement that it was a thing that was awesome and that we loved and that was cool.
I remember specifically waiting until you were 6.
Since I was really little, and I've kind of realized this only in adulthood, and like, whenever I tell somebody this, I preface it with like, I promise this is not like I'm so left-wing that I can't watch any movies if they don't have women in it. But like, I remember genuinely as a kid, like being bored by movies where there weren't that many girls.
Sure.
Like, I was never that into The Lion King because there's not that many girls. Peter Pan, there's not that many girls. Like, lots of movies that, like, you know, my friends talk about, like, oh, I loved that as a kid. I kind of could never really. And that was why I remember thinking to myself, like, when does Princess Leia come in? And you were, because I knew who she was. I had some understanding of who she was, and I'd, you know, seen pictures and everything. And you were like, just wait, she'll come in near the end. And I remember kind of sitting and being like, damn, she's like kind of what I came for. Like, where is this awesome princess, you know?
So it's funny. So your memories are of her once the Death Star escape starts, not of the opening sequence where she stands up to Vader.
I remember really feeling a connection to the character for the first time in the escape sequence. And specifically when she's like, this is some rescue.
This is some rescue. When you came in here, didn't you have a plan for getting out?
That line specifically I remember.
Right.
And that was the moment where I was like, this is the coolest person I've ever seen on my TV screen. Weirdly enough, it reminded me of, like, you know, the women in our family. Seeing like a female character who was like in charge and not afraid to be in charge reminds me of Mom and Grandma.
I don't know who you are or where you came from, but from now on, you do as I tell you, okay?
I would say beginning sometime around your early teenager years,
Mm-hmm.
your connection was not just to Leia, but specifically to Carrie Fisher.
I mean, I'd always kind of felt this attachment to the character because, again, like, it was kind of the first time that I saw, like, a woman in anything that had that much agency. I saw myself in her. I could be bossy as a kid, and
Really?
yeah, I know, shocking.
This is the first I'm hearing of this.
I know, but, I could be bossy as a kid, and I liked to be in charge, and I liked to be in control, because up until then, like, it was pretty much Disney heroines who I was presented with as role models, and at that point in time, in, like, what Disney was doing, most of them were pretty passive. Oddly enough, like, when I started really getting attached to and finding inspiration in Carrie was after her death. I remember reading in the news that morning, that she'd passed. I think I was 14? That was 2016. I remember reading in the news that she had passed, and I remember being really emotional about it because of the significance of Leia in my life. And I remember, like, I read an article about her death that kind of mentioned her work in other areas, her work as a screenwriter specifically. And I remember it mentioned Postcards from the Edge. I think we watched that movie as a family later that week. The thing that really fascinated me was that she was a writer, because that was kind of when I started writing on my own as well. And I remember we watched Postcards from the Edge, and I, had read a little bit about it and read about that it was kind of a fictionalized account of her struggles with addiction and with her mental health and with her relationship with her mom. At the time I was going through a mental health struggle of my own, and I remember just watching that movie and seeing myself in the character and kind of being so awestruck that this woman who I'd grown up with my whole life as, like, a role model was saying all these things that I had been thinking. And yeah, I remember after Postcards from the Edge, I got, like, all her books. I read them all on Kindle. My favorite is still The Princess Diarist, because of specifically the kind of delicacy that she handles her relationship with Harrison, and the way that she details it with great compassion for her younger self, while also realizing that, like, there were some things about that relationship that weren't the best. But I don't know, I always find that aspect of that book really beautiful, just kind of the compassion that she has for her younger self. I read the screenplay for Postcards from the Edge. That was the first screenplay I ever wrote or ever read, and now I'm very into screenwriting. The way she writes scripts, this is a sidebar, but the way she writes scripts is kind of incredible. She has this way of injecting her personality and her sense of humor into, like, the stage directions in a way that's really unique and really creative. Yeah, I got really attached to her work, and she is still a really big inspiration, specifically as a writer. I mean, her acting is great too, but and she talked about in interviews and later in life that it was the writing that she really loved.
Not surprisingly, Star Wars continues to receive high praise among modern audiences. On Rotten Tomatoes, it's got a 93% rating from critics and a 96% rating from the general public. On Letterboxd, it's 5 stars as well, over 40 years after it was first released in theaters. As always, music for this episode was provided by my brother-in-law. His 8-bit Nintendo cover for this episode, as you probably recognize, is Jimmy Buffett's Margaritaville. I hadn't remembered at all that this was new at the same time Star Wars was. You can find my brother-in-law over on Spotify, where he's known as Fabric and does way cooler things than GenX covers for me. What about you? What were your first impressions of Star Wars, and under what circumstances did you first see it? Comment below. If you enjoyed this episode, please help out the channel with a like and subscribe. In my next GenX Movie Month episode, I'm going to keep the original trilogy theme going when we look at May of 1980, and what is still my favorite movie of all time, The Empire Strikes Back. Thanks for watching.